basically you run your cars and your transport on electricity. That means that you don't need to get gas and oil from the Middle East, from Russia, from the US. They have the most power to bring emissions down, and they're also highly exposed. So I would say there's the economic benefits, there's the energy security benefits, and then there's, the confronting climate change benefits. We were dependent on Russia. We've hopefully avoided that now. We've sort of managed to avert that. We don't want to become overly dependent on China now. And there was a sudden realization that China was getting really dominant in this area. And yeah, the sort of Europe and the US were sort of, pursuing these products they knew they were needed for climate mitigation. They were getting better, but it was quite slow. If you want to stop climate change and avoid the impacts of it, you need to reach net zero
Mm.
because then you have a stabilization. China and Russia basically are, able to get nuclear power plants over the line in a way that we don't really seem to be able to in Europe and the US in quite the same way. Fossil fuel companies will use carbon capture in order to help them extract more oil. They'll capture carbon and then they sort of pump it in and it gets more oil out of it.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Science Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Muhammad Ittifaq. You may have heard a lot over the last few months about China. Of course, China is the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, not in totality, but right now, in totality, it's still the United States. But it is also superheading a clean energy revolution with more solar and wind capacity than the rest of the world combined. So that attracts a lot of headlines around the globe. More electric cars on the roads than any other country in the world in China. And China also does not only care about the environment and climate, but also its economy. So maybe it's more of a financial issue for them, but we will discuss that with our guest today. There are also China is doing maybe for economic reasons or maybe for some other reasons we don't know, but we will find out today. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. If it's a purely financial decision, of course, if the country sees if it's a national security threat and they take, measures to tackle climate change, it's good. So it's good for in terms of investment, trade, and of course, in terms of innovation in technology. And recent some reports also suggest that China has installed 6 million solar panels in less than within less than 6 months, which is tremendous. And the energy they produce it can provide energy almost to 4.5 million homes. Joining me now, Chris Aylett. He's a research fellow in the Environment and Society Center at Chatham House in England, and I'm in the US. Chris, welcome to Science Talk.
Thanks very much, Mohammed. It's great to be here.
So let's big overarching question. Like take us there. Like what is going on in China and why they're like kind of leading or revolutionizing this renewable energy.
So the answer to the question of what's happening in China is
Mhm.
really a rapid overhaul, transformation of the entire energy system and really the economy in bigger terms than that. It's really quite extraordinary to see. We sort of hear the reports here, and I've been fortunate enough to go and see some of it myself as well, and it's absolutely extraordinary. They're installing, as you say, more wind, solar than the rest of the world combined, and they're also investing huge amounts in their electricity grid in things like electrified high-speed rail. There are more electric vehicles sold there than conventional petrol vehicles. They're rolling out battery storage, which is really important with renewables. They're kind of doing it all at the same time at a rapid pace, which is really amazing. So to answer the question of why are they
Yeah.
doing this, and this is a great question. So I think you can, I would say you can put it to perhaps three reasons. So one, as you've already sort of outlined, there's the economic benefits.
Mhm.
So it's about 20 years ago, or maybe even a little further back than that, that China kind of in policy documents identified that the clean tech was a strategic sector,
Mhm.
and that it had some advantages that it could leverage and really kind of start manufacturing solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, and so on. Various reasons why they decided they would do that, but they started quite a long time ago, and the government kind of put in place support and subsidies and incentives to try and get lots and lots and lots of companies to basically enter the industry, start innovating, start making things. Obviously, they were based on they were using a lot of kind of technology from Germany and the US and others, and they brought that back and they started refining it and building more and more. And then over time, basically, they just got the stuff's got better and better. It's got cheaper and cheaper until we sort of get to where we are now, where the costs are low and they're making a lot of money out of it. It's a huge contributor to their economy, not just sort of internally, but also in terms of what they're exporting to the world. So there's this economic incentive. Basically, it's the sort of like high technology manufacturing and the economic revenues from that. So that's one thing. Second thing is energy security. So China does have coal, oil, and gas reserves, but it's also got 1.5 billion people, and it uses, not in terms of coal, but well, basically across the board of fossil fuels, but particularly sort of oil and gas, it uses a lot more, it consumes a lot more than it has. So
Mm.
it is import dependent. And what that has meant for quite a few years now is that China is keen to basically diversify its energy supply, so it's not reliant on energy from abroad. It's very keen on being basically energy independent, fully energy secure, and it sees that clean technology, so generating electricity from wind and solar, and also getting off oil. So you don't need to put oil, so basically you run your cars and your transport on electricity. That means that you don't need to get gas and oil from the Middle East, from Russia, from the US. So there's the energy security piece as well. And another piece which I do think is important is actually the climate mitigation piece. So,
Mm.
China is responsible for 30% of global emissions. It has worked on climate change risk assessments, including with the UK and others, and it understands the impacts of climate change. It's already suffering some of them,
Yeah.
and it knows that, this would not be something that they would want. It would be extremely disruptive, and they would like to do everything they can to avoid climate change, to mitigate it. So they realize if they've got 30% of global emissions today, which is far above the US at, 11%, China's and sort of Chinese government's got its hand on the most important lever. If they can bring their emissions down, that will make a material difference
Yeah.
to the amount of climate change they're going to face. So there's the climate change side of it. They have the most power to bring emissions down, and they're also
Mm.
highly exposed. So I would say there's the economic benefits, there's the energy security benefits, and then there's the confronting climate change benefits, which I think we all share.
So 2 points, really important points, because when we sit, both of us are sitting in the West and the global North, which are historically emitted more emissions than any other region in the world, right? Especially like the whole Southern Hemisphere or the global South. And when we hear about China or Russia, they're always like, oh, these communists, like, or dictatorship, you can't say whatever you want to say. We have a freedom, liberty, things, right? But on the other hand, it's interesting you said like they realized 20 years ago when the US or many Western countries were still like a huge opposition if it's climate change is real or not, right? And it's still a huge obstruction elements into these societies which kind of oil and gas lobbies, right? Which are kind of hindering our progress to kind of tackle climate change. On the one hand, we hear these arguments that the West is always leading in science and technology and innovation. But now China, which is just like 77, 76 years old, not that like doesn't have a 250 years of history like the US or many other European countries, and they realized earlier than many other countries in the world to see like this is the future and we have to do that and like using it as a strategic benefit, this whole climate change. And these countries were not able to do that, and I just want to like understand from you and for the audience that, I mean, why these countries haven't realized that? Is it because they established their economies and financial systems based on fossil fuel, or these are petrostates and they always look for export of these oil and gas, or is there something else that these democracies couldn't see those things and China realized that earlier and now they're leading, the revolution in clean tech?
Well, I'd say just first of all, certainly think China considers itself a sort of, a sort of civilizational culture of many sort of millennia. But I think you're right that its industrialization
Mm.
is very recent, and the extent to which it's grown and introduced sort of modernization in its cities is pretty recent, and yeah, it's been incredible to see. So I think basically ever since sort of climate change was identified as a serious issue that the
Mhm.
world had to grapple with, you could date this a long way back, but sort of potentially sort of after the Second World War, and then there was research in it. Um, it was kind of realized quite early on by the Western oil
Yes.
companies,
Mhm.
particularly like Exxon, for example, that this was gonna pose a threat because it basically meant that they look at their balance sheets, it's based on lots and lots of fossil fuel assets, and
Mhm.
really, they are causing a problem. It's causing the world to warm. They didn't quite know at that stage exactly what the effects would be, but they were starting to work out that they probably weren't going to be great. So they were commissioning all this interesting research into it and working out what the problems were. And there's probably a moment when they could have, sort of Exxon, but also generally sort of other Western fossil fuel companies, um, said, right, we are not going to carry down this road. We've got lots and lots of
Yeah.
capital built up in these sectors. We're going to start investing in the alternatives, and we're going
Mhm.
to be energy companies, but we're going to be doing energy which is compatible with averting climate change. But alas, as we sort of know the stories, they didn't do that. They basically started kind of seeding disinformation about climate change. And because these companies are so wealthy,
Yeah.
that buys you access, that buys you as much media coverage as you like. And so really the sort of the contemporary kind of effort against
Mhm.
climate change, which you could also say kind of started towards the end of the 1980s, early 1990s with the formation of the UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention
Mhm.
on Climate Change and the COP summit. It's been really difficult because there's been this already within the system a lot of opposition because it's going
Yeah.
to, basically cost a lot of people a lot of money and a lot of power. And
Yes.
you've got the companies, but then you've also got countries that are associated with that. So obviously Saudi Arabia, for example, is
Yes.
very dependent on fossil fuel revenues and others.
Mhm.
So I think there's basically that. So you've got what you say, petro states and
Mhm.
states that are basically very dependent on that revenue for their, to fund their government, or just basically because it's beneficial to certain players. China it was different because they obviously they do have their incumbent opposition, they do, but they don't have the same level of kind of it's not earning them export revenue in
Mhm.
quite the same way. And obviously, in a society such as China, where it is, authoritarian
Mhm.
regime and strongly controlled, basically, yeah, you have there is different levels and there's lobbying and so on, but you can sort of set the strategic direction of the country, and that can sort of filter down through the state-owned companies, through the private enterprises across the provinces, and they all sort of start pulling together. I think what's interesting with China is one big thing they did sort of respond to, I think, was that in because a lot of the early kind of deployment of like solar PV, for example, was driven by German policy. So Germany was starting in industry, but then it also implemented feed-in tariffs, which basically was, incentivizing people to buy solar panels. And basically what China did is they recognize that as a sort of market opportunity. They're like, hey, well, that's going to be our demand driver. And then we make the solar panels and we sort of sell them to Germany. So they were on the back of that really. And then I think with electric vehicles, for example,
Mhm.
so batteries, which is another part of the picture. They were trying, as I understand it, kind of, they wanted to compete. China wanted to compete with the sort of European and American auto manufacturers in sort of internal combustion engine, and
Mhm.
they weren't having a great deal of success. And they saw that battery electric vehicles was an area which was really only
Yeah.
just emerging. They saw it kind of dovetailed with some of their existing capacities, and then they chose that, and then they carried on. And I think, these were strategic decisions they made a long time ago, and they could have gone wrong.
Yeah.
And I think there was a lot of iterative learning, and certain things didn't work. But it turns out that we've seen these now are
Yeah.
sort of becoming popular and successful, and in many ways, not as we're talking about, not the reason people are buying a lot of sort of clean
Mhm.
technology is not necessarily due to because they want to reduce emissions. Obviously, that is a driver to some extent, but because it's a cheap way of generating electricity, or because electric cars are very appealing because they now are cheaper to run in some places than petrol vehicles, and they're kind of very impressive sort of technologically. So yeah,
Absolutely.
it was a gamble, but they
It
were
worked
able
out.
to
It
go
worked
for
out
it.
for them.
Exactly.
Yeah, and some people say they're like, oh, they use the phrase China is eating our lunch, and some of them are happy with it, and some of them are not happy with it. How do you see the West as overall looking at China, seeing that China is spearheading, the clean energy revolution, and they're also attending COP30. They attended COP30, US was not there. And some people say like US actually created that vacuum and China is filling that gap. They're not only becoming self-sufficient in energy and energy security, but also exporting a lot to the global south. So are you happy that they're eating our lunch, or you see that like a lot of Western countries are still kind of hesitant to import that? Because you said earlier that they learned and they were in talks with England and UK and with other countries, and they learned that they realized that, and they changed the things, and now they're able to export that technology. How the West is seeing that?
Yes, well, this is the how the West sees China's technological rise in sort of clean technology, but across the board is really defining a lot of sort of geopolitical turbulence we seeing today. It's a fascinating topic that colleagues and I here are looking at all the time. The I think that there was a point towards the end of the kind of 2010s
Mhm.
when there was a sudden realization that China was getting really dominant in this area. And yeah, the sort of Europe and the US were sort of, pursuing these products they knew they were needed for climate mitigation. They were getting better, but it was quite a slow process. But around the end of the sort of, sort of just before COVID, there was a point around which the US, I think when sort of Joe Biden became president, his team were looking into the extent of dependency on China, and then they saw, sort of the critical minerals
Yeah.
and solar panels and the components in solar panels, and across the supply chain, and they realized this is a big problem.
Mm.
And the EU and Europe had a similar sort of shock
Feeling.
when they sort of I would say this is all kind of happening around the same time, but there was this sort of shock on the US side, and then there was a shock on the European side as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that was the sort of weaponization of a dependence. So Europe being a very open sort of trading bloc, broadly been quite happy basically to import lots and lots from China. It was, relationship wasn't always great, but it was willing to sort of, benefit from that. Largely, they were kind of, it wasn't always easy, and there sort of where tariffs were put on here and there over the 2010s. But as a result of the Russian war in Ukraine, Europe said, right, we were dependent on Russia. We've hopefully avoided that now. We've sort of managed to avert that. We don't want to become overly dependent on China now. So the US basically implemented the Inflation Reduction Act, which
Yeah.
was, to sort of try and reshore a lot of this and rebuild American manufacturing. And that was because the sheer American like financial firepower, these
Mm.
kind of like, almost like bottomless subsidies for clean energy manufacturing, they were actually able to start making a bit of headway. I mean, China was so dominant that it was always going to take a long time. But under the Inflation Reduction Act, they started to kind of eat into that
Mm.
mainly for kind of batteries, but for other things too. And then, of course, what's happened under Trump is he's basically gutted that. Europe doesn't have the same sort of financial firepower
Mm.
as the US. So it's done a lot of things to try and, sort of reshore supply chains and encourage domestic manufacturing, but it's really not got quite the capacity. So it's having to have lots of conversations now. What do we, what is a what is a healthy dependence
Mm.
on China for
Yeah.
clean technology? And where can we diversify and where can we not diversify? And it's got its own decarbonisation targets, which are quite stringent. It's
Mm.
also got, sees clean energy as a way towards energy security as well. So it's got quite the dilemma there, I think. But yeah, the in sort of Europe and in North America, people know about the China shock
Yeah.
of the early 2000s, and there's an association with sort of Chinese products might equal kind of industrial decline and job losses. So that comes into it too. So it's a really mixed picture. But just to
Yeah.
just to finish, I'm aware I've gone into a lot of detail here, but from a climate change mitigation point of view, I can't see the progress China has made on bringing down the costs of these technologies and increasing their sophistication, for me, that is a unambiguously good thing because that is a really bright spot in a lot of dark sort of news about climate change. But the fact that the alternatives are now cost competitive with sort of high carbon versions, conventional versions, that is a really good thing. But of course, I acknowledge that the fact that all of that is concentrated in one country and that that's capturing so much of the value, that obviously is not ideal and is
Yeah.
having sort of political ramifications.
Absolutely. And I think in the West, and when I talk with people, there's some of them would say that like if some of the one of the misconceptions about climate change or myths about climate change is that, oh, if the US or the West would transition to clean energy, China and India won't do it. But they're already doing it, right? So they're already doing it. And also, like, related to my previous question, do you think that like the US and the Europe is always see China very differently, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of wars, in terms of competition, and they hugely like kind of misread China in terms of what is their potential and what could they do in terms of climate change and clean energy because they were like so much locked into, like Taiwan and AI chips and a lot of other trade wars and things like that. And meanwhile, China was like kind of realizing that like we have to do this if we don't want to get in too much, devastation from climate change. We have to transition to this for the security reasons, for financial reasons, for trade reasons, and all that. And you think like these countries, especially the West, misread China, especially its potential to tackle climate change. On the other hand, China is also building coal power plants, which is kind of really interesting, and nuclear reactors too,
Yeah.
right? Nuclear plants too. So on the one hand, the West, some people say there's a huge lobby against for nuclear against nuclear, but on the other hand, China is like developing rapid pace. In the West, it takes like a decade or 20 years to build one nuclear plant, but they are doing it and they're also kind of still building coal power plant. So what is going on? Is China deceiving the West again to see like, oh, we are the clean energy producers and we are going to revolutionize, but on the other hand, you're still kind of producing more coal and maybe also going nuclear.
I think it's right to say that the West underestimated China
Hmm.
and the speed with which it would find itself at the technological frontier.
Hmm.
And be not just sort of taking Western designs and selling sort of
Hmm.
cheaper Chinese versions, but really innovating itself. And we're seeing that across the board. That's not just in clean technology. That's also in like military technology as well. And as you say, sort of like large language models. We saw what DeepSeek
Hmm.
sort of came along early this year and surprised
Yeah.
some of the AI folks in the US. But yeah, so I think that absolutely there's been an underestimation of China's potential and resolve and, amazing really the ability of the system to do this. And actually what's interesting, I think, is a particular thing about electric vehicles.
Hmm.
That happened a lot. The progress in that happened sort of during the pandemic. It was almost when the people weren't particularly paying attention. It was kind of after the pandemic that suddenly they had these amazing electric vehicles that they were loading onto ships and sending around the world. So I think, yeah, that's right. So basically, yeah, I think China has been really, in terms of technological development, it's been underestimated. That much is clear. In terms of what China is now doing about its own energy mix,
Hmm.
I think it is sincere in
Hmm.
its desire to reduce emissions. Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping, he, committed, so this is associated with him as the leader, at the UN General Assembly, in 2021 to two goals, carbon peaking and carbon neutrality. So it's basically peak emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality, net zero by 2060. And they still define how, a lot of this policy is pursued. They're still highly relevant in sort of guiding the Chinese economy in a way that, like, for example, I don't know about you, but like sort of net zero is talked a lot about in the
Yeah.
UK 5 years ago, particularly when we had COP26. And it's not talked about now. In fact, some people, it's slightly been weaponized. It's a kind of dirty
Yes.
word. But in China, that is very much still guiding how they are going about things. The green transformation, the ecological civilization, these sort of nice terms they have for things, but it's like we are moving towards these goals. So I think that's sincere. I think that's going to happen. The fact is that it includes China's so big and it's using up so much
Yeah.
energy,
Yes.
because it's such a sort of production powerhouse
Mhm.
that it kind of needs to do a lot of things at the same time, and that's
Mhm.
exactly what it is doing. What's interesting about coal is that it this sort of build out of coal-fired power plants is to some
Yeah.
extent a an energy security strategy. A few years ago, there was a major drought in China, which basically knocked a lot of their hydropower offline. And at the same time, there was a lot of use of air conditioners because of the heat. And basically, it meant that they were suddenly quite short of electricity for a
Mhm.
whole host of reasons, a lot of it to do with how the grid is managed. But basically, they had blackouts in lots of different parts of the country, and there was a lot of, public unrest. So around the country, sort of in the different provinces, there was a kind of resolve, we can't let that happen again. And that is what has driven a lot of the recent spree in building coal-fired power plants is basically make sure we've got enough capacity. They're not being used as much as they would be in Europe or the US.
Mhm.
They're a high rate of utilization. They're used less. They're kind of there. I mean, they're being used, no doubt about
Mhm.
it, but it's not the same utilization rate. They don't need to be profitable in quite the same way as they do here. But that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing these coal-fired power plants coming online, but they were kind of ordered basically back
Yeah.
in, I think, 2022, 2023, off the back of this kind of crisis. So that's one of the reasons, but it's basically, yeah, I mean, that's part of it, but obviously, there is a there is a strong lobby in, coal is still 60% of Chinese energy mix. So, they have their same sort of incumbent issues as well. So that's one part of it. Nuclear, yeah, exactly. They're building nuclear, and actually, they're more successful at building it than a lot of
Yeah.
other places. China and Russia basically are, able to get nuclear power plants over the line in a way that we don't really seem to be able to in Europe and the US in quite the same way. I'm not an expert in nuclear, so I don't know quite why that is, but you assume it's, sort of, they've got very, they're sort of highly efficient and it's
Mhm.
a kind of country of engineers and so on. And, there may be, different regulatory guidelines.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
yeah, I believe they're able to, the average sort of, maybe they'll get a nuclear plant built in like 10 years, whereas
Yeah.
I think in Europe it's been more like 20 plus.
Yeah, they said 17 to
Um,
20 years, like your 25 years. It takes that much time. And I mean, I have talked with like several experts, and they say there are some folks who are like, say, yeah, we do need nuclear for clean energy transition, but some say like, absolutely not. It's too late, too risky, too expensive. Like France is spending hundreds of billions of dollars to repair and to maintain them, so it's too costly. Probably not. So now it's a great segue to my other question is about net zero. There's a video on YouTube. It's called the Net Zero Guru called it like a scam. Is it like really a scam? Like there has been a lot of talk around net zero. What is this like? Are we getting there, or like is it just kind of something we talked about and moved on, or are we still kind of actively trying to get to net zero? And do we have to for climate change?
Yeah, as we touched upon this earlier, didn't we? The idea that sort of net zero was talked about a lot, sort of
Yes.
5 years ago, and yeah, the UK was, I think, the first major economy to set a net zero target, and then loads of other countries followed suit, and actually, sort of by the end of 2021, 2022, like it was, covering most of the world, like many countries had set a net zero target, and the basic principle is, I mean, it's a scientific term. It's basically like, you want your sinks of carbon, so what's absorbing your carbon, to be balanced with your emissions. So it basically means that the amount of carbon, the concentrations in the air sort of stays at sort of so it's like it balances, it's stable, and that's when you sort of reach net zero. And at that point, in broad terms, sort of, you stop having the greenhouse effect and the planet stops warming.
Hmm.
So basically, if you want to stop climate change and avoid the impacts of it, you need to reach net zero
Mm.
because then you have a stabilization. So as soon as you basically reach that,
Mm.
you may still have the effects and you may have gone through tipping points, but basically it means that you're not continuing to heat up the planet. So yeah, scientifically, I mean, it's unavoidable. Basically, we do
Mm.
need to reach it. That is the point at which we will stop being exposed to these consequences. The net bit of it is interesting because if you imagine that, yeah, we're creating a lot of emissions,
Yeah.
but then some people will say, well, we don't need to reduce the emissions to zero if
Hmm.
we increase the negative, so the net bit,
Yeah.
basically, if we increase what we're taking out. So this is why you hear talk of carbon capture and other things, which basically, suck the carbon out of the air. And in theory, you can sort of imagine, if you have a coal-fired power plant and you emit X sort of tons of carbon, but then you have next to it, you have a carbon capture plant and
Mm.
you suck that exact same amount.
Yeah.
Arguably, it doesn't
Which
matter.
cancels it out, so it's going to balance it.
That's right. But the thing is, negative emissions are problematic for all sorts of reasons.
Mm.
One thing is about on carbon capture, there's very little of it in practice being used
Yes.
around the world.
Yeah.
One of the main things, I mean, there's lots of issues with it, not least where you store all the carbon, you need to store it permanently. But it's the electricity that you need in order to run the carbon capture machines. Because then you're just into this cycle.
Yeah.
It's just huge. And like if you were to basically continue our current system but have enough carbon capture to get rid of it, it would be using like such a huge percentage of like global electricity just to run these machines. So there's this kind of problem there. And also it's basically it's just not really operational
Mm.
anywhere other than in things like enhanced oil recovery, where
Mm.
they basically fossil fuel companies will use carbon capture in order to help them extract more oil. They'll capture carbon and then they sort of pump it in and it gets more oil out of it. But there's various reasons why carbon capture is a difficult one. So obviously, other thing is like sinks, like natural sinks, like forests and oceans, and that is kind of comes from avoiding deforestation and so on. And there's a whole set of other kind of difficulties around that, around countries that, sort of feel in order to pursue economic development, they do need to sort of reduce forests and so on. So yeah, in some ways, like net zero makes perfect scientific sense, is something we will need to reach. But but it has been used by some as an excuse to say we can carry on emitting fossil fuel, we can carry on emitting carbon,
Mm.
we will just suck it all out the air later. But that is
Yeah.
sort of highly problematic. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's probably where the sort of debate sort of stands. And yeah, I
Because
think we
that
absolutely need to.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. Like once we emit, the GHG emissions, that it means like this stays up there for thousands of years, and it's super hard to capture it, to kind of reduce the, like kind of. That's why we are like kind of like, what? We have to produce less. We have to emit less. That's the only way. Because like it's not like, oh, we can like keep emitting and we'll think about it later. For example, when West Virginia set a coal power plants there, this like, what? It's economic. It's economy reasons. All the people moved over there, new jobs, new things. Guess what? You didn't think about once the coal is gonna be gone, what these people are going to do, what these cities and towns are going to do, what's the alternative, what's the next plan. The same thing is happening right now with the data centers. They're putting these data centers for like, oh, for jobs and like innovation of these technologies and all that. But like, guess what? Like, why do we always think that in terms of policies? Because you're also do a lot of work on policy, and like, why do we always think economics first, and then we say like, what about the environment, about clean air, about these issues, we'll think about that later. Why is that always we don't think about the consequences first, and then what, this is what we're going to end up in 10, 20 years, so better we have to do something now in order to reduce it instead of do something now, harm the environment, pollute the air, and then after 10, 20 years you think about the ramifications. Another example of AI, everybody's talking about like, developing, competing, automation and all that. And then in 20 years, when we're gonna don't have jobs and like, everything is automated, and we're not thinking about what people are going to do, where's the like, is there a universal basic income kind of plan or something? So the world always sees the economic opportunity, go for it, and then after 10, 20 years, we are kind of thinking about like, oh my God, what to do about it? Like, why do we do that way?
It's a yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think basically it's just there's this pursuit of there's a pursuit of profit, there's the pursuit of opportunity, there's the kind of hype, the hype
Mhm.
cycles people get caught in. It's just, I mean, obviously you mentioned AI, and it's just talked about as suddenly everyone needs to have some sort of AI play, whether you're a country, whether you're a company, and it's just, yeah, and it's not clear necessarily what the benefits are going to be. I mean, for example, yeah, as you say, like there's not a lot of jobs involved in a data center, and there never will be really. So it is kind of, yeah, I think probably it might be inherent in our kind of current systems of government, a
Mm,
degree of short-sightedness.
mm.
And we see it in sort of policy in the UK, like just kind of getting over a particular hump, making a particular budget add up, pleasing a particular constituency, or maybe politicians sort of doing a donor, giving a sort of favor to a donor, and that's always a big thing. Is basically what do the where's the what does the money want? And then yeah, we sort of clean up the mess later. And I think that's one of the things that people have been concerned about with net zero is that there might be, if you listen too much to the technological side of it, there's this narrative of we will basically, technology is going to save us. We'll
Yes.
basically more or less do what we're going to do now. We'll do a bit of clean energy, but I think it's going to be fantastic in a few years. I think it was Jensen Huang of CEO of NVIDIA. He said something like, "Oh, you might complain about the electricity usage from AI data centers
Oh,
and the water
already,
usage."
already. I
Yeah,
received the email last month. I was furious that my bill and my electric bill is going to be $11 more every month from January
really,
2026. I was furious. Like literally in the state of Virginia, they have the highest number of data centers in the world. They like
really.
already, yes, they put like 250 already, and they're putting even more. So it's just kind of like crazy the way these tech bros tell us, like, oh, this technology is going to solve climate change. Absolutely BS. I do not, believe in that at all. So is that UK kind of how are you guys like kind of tackling this whole thing? Especially you say like the net zero started from there, and then a whole lot of bunch of other countries. Some people say like we're not gonna get into that. It's just kind of like it's not a viable thing to do. And now these data centers and electricity bills and all that and the cost of it and the water, like and the water consumption and energy consumption of the data centers. So how the EU or like and the UK is seeing that, because tech bros are here in the US, and they just kind of it's easy to manipulate politicians in the US the way political system works here, and the campaign funds and all that, and the economy. Because if you the scariest thing for people in the US is economy. And the second is energy. Oh, you won't be able to watch your TV on Christmas Eve. People gonna freak out to that. So it's just kind of that kind of thing we have kind of put a fear in the society around that. So how it's like kind of UK or EU kind of deal with that kind of situation when it comes to like taking measures. I because here in the US we see Europe and UK and China and other countries are doing much more to tackle climate change than the US, and it's really sad.
Yeah, no, well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your electricity bill, and my worry is that it may continue going up
Yeah.
because of because of the policies of the of your government. Yeah, as I say, AI data centers is one, but also interesting dynamic is that because Trump basically has been very keen to export as much gas overseas, that means that there's actually kind of less circulating within the US, which means it's scarcer, which means it's, because a lot of your power is gas-fired power. So that is also likely to push electricity prices up. So that's something we're going to be following quite carefully. So yeah, commiserations for that. But yeah, how it's sort of, Well, it's been interesting in the UK because until about 2 or 3 years ago, there was actually quite a good consensus between the kind of the two main parties about the need to tackle climate change and the value of clean energy. And we had basically kind of 15, almost 20 years of kind of pretty solid, evidence-based, economically minded action on climate change and on decarbonising the economy, particularly the electricity system, and had a lot of success. Basically, we have really high share of renewable energy, particularly wind, in our electricity generation, and yeah, we brought emissions down hugely as a result. It's been a little bit easier here than in some other countries because we don't really have a fossil fuel industry. Well, we do. We have oil and gas in the North Sea, but we don't have like a coal industry, for example. We did, but that kind of got put an end to in the 1980s. And also, we don't have a lot of manufacturing. A lot of that has gone to China. So in some ways, basically, we're a service-based economy, and decarbonising has come to where we are now has been relatively sort of pain-free. What we're moving into now is a situation where we need people to move to things like electric vehicles, which they are doing gradually, but also things like heat pumps. So basically, we make most of the way most people heat their houses or their homes in the UK with gas,
Yeah.
and that just is piped in, and it's pretty significant trying to change that to say what we need is an electric heat pump, and that is becoming that's probably the most difficult thing we're facing in the UK is sort of getting people to switch because it's expensive, and actually you don't necessarily see the cost benefits across the board. You might somewhere down the line, and the subsidies aren't there yet. There's not enough to really incentivize it. It's quite a big thing to get it installed. So yeah, the sort of transition has been going generally pretty well. Like in the UK, we have things called carbon budgets, 5 yearly carbon budgets, and there's been three, I think, and they've all been met. And now we're moving into the next one, and they're planning carbon budgets for, decades in the future. Actually, we've got quite a good framework for dealing with all of this, but we're getting into the more knotty, difficult stuff that people are going to start noticing. And naturally, basically, it's kind of, by the sort of the far right and now unfortunately the kind of centre right have kind of gotten on this, we can't do net zero, we can't do net zero emissions, it's expensive and so on and so forth, which is really unfortunately just misrepresenting the facts because generation from renewable energy is sort of like now cheaper than fossil fuels. We've got some oil and gas remaining in the North Sea, but even if we do extract it, like it's not ours, it's
Mm.
belongs to international oil companies. So there's a whole kind of narrative pushing back, which is like culture war, basically. So we're in a bit of a difficult situation, but we do have basically an energy and climate minister that is driving ahead quite determinedly on this and has been making a lot of progress. So yeah, I remain cautiously optimistic about the UK's sort of transition.
Yeah, there are like people who, when I talk to them, they're like, I'm a cautious optimist and I'm a realist and I'm a doomer and I'm, kind of different. So how do you characterize yourself when you look at, the reports, which are like kind of very sad, when you look at 1.5 C or 3 degree by 2050 or 2100. So, and also you see the devastation, like what is going on right now in East Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and all those countries, seeing the flooding. So, how do you see yourself kind of, are you still hopeful that we can, stay below three or, keep up with 1.5 degrees Celsius? Are you a hopeful person or cautious optimist, realist, doomer, or like you lost hope? Where do you stand?
I think um, I remember I had a bit of a kind of eureka moment a few years ago when I used to swing. Previously, I'd swing between like complete despair and then a bit of hope. But when you kind of realize that every fraction of a degree matters, that you do get your tipping points, and they are absolutely a concern. But in the round, what you want to be doing is making sure that the sort of increase in temperature rise is as small as possible. And then it's kind of like everything to play for. You just need to keep working to that. I do think that, yeah, meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement is going to be really, really challenging because of the political environment, which has really deteriorated since 2015. So I do feel quite pessimistic about meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, but broadly, I think we just need to keep working for every fraction of a degree. And what I am encouraged by is the new economics of clean energy. So that is both the supply side, so renewable energy, but also the kind of demand side, so like electric transportation. And increasingly, you're seeing some really positive stuff happening in industry as well, which is quite difficult to decarbonize, like steel and cement. So I actually feel quite encouraged by that. And you're seeing a lot of these clean technologies be disseminated around the world. And, they want them because they're cheap and because they help with energy security. So there's some really important and positive dynamics happening there. So I'd say sort of, the sort of clean energy transition. I actually do feel quite optimistic about that. I feel that because the prices have come down and because it's now so sophisticated, the equipment, it seems like that is hopefully that will happen. It's going to require a huge amount of work, but it does seem like it's moving in that direction. So yeah, that's sort of where I place myself. I think it is it's really hard to sort of to bear the idea that a lot of this was foreseen and a lot of the sort of death and destruction we're seeing, as you say, in South Asia. But we had those really terrible floods in Pakistan, and you've got brutal heat waves in China and killed a lot of people, and just lots of parts of the world, and some of the most vulnerable people. That is hard to bear. I mean, the kind of the injustice of it all is that is really, really difficult. And I think that's what really sort of galls me a lot about the current US approach, which is really to say, we don't believe in it and it's nothing to do with us. And we're not going to do anything. That is a little bit hard to take. So try not to
Yeah.
dwell too much on that. But
Yeah.
broadly, I think there's everything to fight for, and
Mhm.
we should continue fighting.
Absolutely. My last question would be, what is something we need to spend more time and our heartbeats talking, and we are not spending as much time when it comes to climate change, energy, environment?
Okay, this is a little bit it's a little bit niche, but
Mhm.
if we're talking about the sort of portfolio of clean technologies, I think we're going to need to pay more attention to wind. So
Mhm.
solar and batteries and EVs are spreading really
Yeah.
fast, and they're fantastic,
Mhm.
and consumers like them, and governments like them. Wind is also brilliant,
Mhm.
but it's struggling a bit because it's bigger projects, and in sort of high interest rate environments, it really suffers. And as we've seen in the US, it can be really the target of kind of political pushback. And
Mhm.
I gather trying to get offshore wind done in the US is incredibly difficult.
Because
Um,
we don't like bird cemeteries. So, every underneath every windmill, there's a bird cemetery. If you want to see it kills birds, so we don't want to see that. We are kind-hearted
yeah,
people.
there's some. Certainly some interesting views on that. I mean, obviously, there's nothing is perfect. There's always
Yeah,
things to mitigate, but I suspect a lot of the facts around this have been pretty heavily massaged to make a point.
absolutely.
These aren't a lot of the time people that say that they're not people that have tended to care about birds before. I've noticed, but yeah, no, absolutely, there are things we need to mitigate, and renewable energies are sort of problematic in different ways.
Mhm.
They're certainly not a sort of panacea,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
yeah, basically, if you imagine that like wind and solar are very complementary in
Mhm.
terms of generating electricity, like basically, solar during the day, and often offshore wind, particularly at night, basically like, strong winds. So between the two of them, and when you bring batteries into the equation, you can, with good grid management, you can really start to sort of power your whole system. If you're not getting wind deployed at the same level and you've just got solar and batteries, it's going to be much more difficult.
Yeah.
So I think trying to focus on easing some of the issues around wind and
Mhm.
not necessarily just focusing on the stuff that's working really well, but like, wind is a crucial part of this and it's struggling a bit, certainly struggling in Europe. And I think it would be good for those who want to see emissions come down, who want to see more renewable deployment to maybe spend more time focusing on what's blocking more deployment of wind, and that's what I'm going to be looking at in the coming months. I think because it's become a little bit underappreciated
Mhm.
in the sort of global clean energy success story, and but I think it's no less critical.
Absolutely. with that, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Chris, once again for your time, expertise, and your work.